Picking up from our last discussion on Nietzsche's poetic defense of history, we now turn to a more critical stance. He saw this pervasive malady of history, this overwhelming weight of the past that can paralyze the present. And here's the kicker: the cure, he argued, is history itself. It sounds paradoxical, right? Like needing poison to cure poisoning. But Nietzsche believed it was necessary. You have to understand the historical roots of your historical culture to break free from it. It's like needing a map of the maze to escape it. The goal? To achieve a perspective beyond mere history, something unhistorical or superhistorical. What exactly does this unhistorical or superhistorical viewpoint entail? Well, the unhistorical is about embracing art, the power of forgetting, and drawing a boundary around yourself, focusing on your own small world. Think of it as creating your own little bubble of reality. But the superhistorical is more ambitious. It's about looking beyond the relentless flow of becoming, the constant change, and finding what gives life its enduring shape, its eternal character. For Nietzsche, that's art and religion, specifically the Dionysian chaos and the Apollonian form. So both approaches are antidotes, ways to counteract the suffocating grip of history, to essentially cure the disease caused by being too much in history. Nietzsche paints a pretty bleak picture of modern culture. He says it's lost all wonder, all genuine surprise. Everything is just okay, which means it's neither truly loved nor hated. The result? A generation adrift, homeless, doubting everything, every idea, every moral code. They know it was different in every age, so they conclude what you are does not matter. Now, since art stands against this historical tide, how can history be useful? Only if it transforms into a pure work of art. It needs to preserve and even awaken our instincts. But beware! A historical vision that only destroys without building anything new will eventually lead to burnout. Those who destroy illusions, whether their own or others, ultimately face the ultimate tyrant, nature. You can't just tear things down, you have to build something up. Now, let's talk about use and abuse of history. This essay is interesting because it's more analytical, more grounded in traditional philosophical critique compared to his later, more poetic works. It feels like he's putting on his academic hat. But despite this, its core function is ultimately destructive. It's like clearing brush before planting a new garden. It tears down the old ways of thinking about history, but doesn't immediately show us what the new garden should look like. It doesn't give us a blueprint for that tragic artistic historiography he mentions elsewhere. Instead, it acts as a kind of ground-clearing operation, preparing the intellectual space for his later masterpiece, The Birth of Tragedy. The Birth of Tragedy picks up this thread. It argues forcefully for a new way of understanding Greek tragedy, positioning it against the poetic visions of his time, including Wagner's, which he still respected then. But here's the snag. While he sets up this contrast, the actual process of how the vibrant Dionysian Apollonian vision of ancient Greece got twisted into something less potent, something degenerate, remains somewhat mysterious in this book. He laments the decline but doesn't fully explain the mechanism. However, hints are there. He's hovering near a theory of historical process, something related to his ideas about remembering and forgetting, and the different types of historians he outlines later. So, what kind of history does Nietzsche want? Does he demand a specific structure, a narrative arc, a focus on individuals versus events? Not really. He grants the historian significant freedom. The form and purpose of a historical work depend entirely on the historian's sense of the life needs of their own time. What does society need to hear? What kind of story resonates? The only hard line is against certain pitfalls. Don't just worship the past blindly. That's uncritical monumental or antiquarian history, and don't just tear it all down cynically. That's unheroic critical history. He basically gives the historian carte blanche, as long as they're conscious of their choices and their impact. And where did he demonstrate this? In his Genealogy of Morals. Genealogy of Morals is like a case study in applying this superhistorical method. He tackles morality itself. Where do these concepts of good and evil come from? Where does conscience originate? He starts by dismantling Rousseau's view, the idea that humans were naturally good but corrupted by society. Nietzsche flips it. Humans weren't inherently anything. They fell into goodness, and this very condition created all sorts of human discontent. Crucially, he offers a framework, a schema, for mapping the history of Western morality, suggesting that this history points towards a future release from this very constraining goodness. This release isn't like Marx's dream of a classless community. No, Nietzsche envisions something far more radical: liberation from the need to associate with others. It's the dream of individual self-sufficiency, pure anarchy. He calls this heroic or superhumanity, but let's be honest, it's anarchy nonetheless. And it's terrifying, because it involves dissolving all the values we thought underpin society. Does this mean the social stage is useless? Not entirely. Nietzsche acknowledges that this stage of self-denial, of willlessness and reasonableness, was necessary to hone human attributes like will and reason. But ultimately, this social stage is seen as temporary, destined to be overcome by critical thought, paving the way for the breakup of reason and society itself, leading to a higher barbarism where the individual lives life as art. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of morality. Nietzsche launches an attack on utilitarians, calling them historians of ethics. He mocks them for just listing rules without questioning them, for thinking unhistorically. So, what does it mean to think historically here? It means trying to imagine yourself back into the mindset of a free, noble aristocracy. These were the folks who took it upon themselves to define what's good and what's bad based on their own preferences. They had the lordly right to name things. Their language was direct, almost innocent, metaphorical, like art. They just said, "This is that," claiming symbolic ownership. Contrast that with the weak. Their language is always full of second thoughts, hidden motives, secret agendas. When a noble feels resentment, it's immediate, absorbed, doesn't fester. But the weak, they project their resentment onto an enemy figure, an evil one. And in doing so, they create a corresponding good one themselves. See the linguistic trick, the strong use metaphor, the language of art. The weak are forced into conceptual thinking, the language of science, philosophy, and religion. This distinction between metaphor and concept is key to understanding Nietzsche's critique of morality. To back this up, Nietzsche dives into etymology. He argues that the words for good, bad, and evil reveal their social origins. The rebellion against the original aristocratic amorality comes from a new kind of anti-aristocracy, led by priests who split off from the strong. These new rulers, representing the herd, are defined by rancor. Their masterstroke? A linguistic sleight of hand. They call their rancor love. This rancor, born from repressed will to power, leads to a transvaluation of values. The strong call their actions good. The weak, twisting this, call the strong's actions evil and their own good. Boom. The simple good-bad distinction is replaced by the metaphysical good-evil split. The first was just about feeling pleasure or pain. The second attributes a qualitative evil substance to actions. How do we cut through this metaphysical fog? Nietzsche turns to health. Health for him is about emotions expressed directly and immediately. Think of it as the body's natural state mirroring the mind's metaphorical state. When an emotion is blocked, it creates a reservoir of dammed-up energy. This energy finds an outlet indirectly as rancor. And rancor manifests as mental activity, searching for causes, blaming the strong. To explain their own weakness, the rancorous person labels the strong as possessing not just strength but a negative quality, evil. It's a linguistic transformation. Weakness becomes merit, cowardice becomes humility. The whole history of morality, Nietzsche suggests, is driven by this shift from the innocent, metaphorical grasp of the world to the more complex, potentially oppressive, modes of metonymy and synecdoche. Nietzsche, trained as a philologist, likely saw the evolution of language as a model for the evolution of consciousness. He didn't fully realize it perhaps, but he was using a tropological theory, the progression that from metaphor to metonymy and synecdoche to irony, to explain cultural and moral history. Remembering and forgetting, promising and binding ourselves to the past or future, all these are tangled up with the errors inherent in those later, more analytical modes of thought. The fall into morality, into self-mutilation, is ultimately a fall deeper into these linguistic possibilities. The path back to the innocence of metaphor. Now, let's look at guilt and bad conscience in the second essay. Nietzsche re-examines memory. He sees it not just as recall but as a willful act, binding ourselves to a fixed past and a fictitious future, like keeping promises. Conscience, then, is this capacity to remember, giving past oaths power over the present. But forgetting has its own function. It shuts out noise, protects consciousness, makes room for nobler functions. It allows us to see the present clearly. Both promising and remembering impose fictional forms, one on the future, one on the past. Bad conscience is the inability to own your past actions, seeing them as done by some external force or quality. Good conscience is the power to say, I did that, it came from me. Creative forgetting, then, is remembering your own will, your own powers. So, how do we create lasting memory, especially for societies? How do you make things stick when humans are naturally forgetful? Nietzsche's answer is stark: only through pain. Culture, like personal memory, is forged in pain, not pleasure. Think about it. The most horrific sacrifices, the most grotesque rituals, the cruelest practices across all religions, they all stem from an instinct that pain is the strongest way to make something memorable. In early human history, when memory was weak, the most brutal methods were needed to teach basic social rules, to instill a few I won'ts that allowed individuals to participate in society. Pain was the original mnemonic device. Where does bad conscience come from? Nietzsche traces the word guilt back to a term meaning to be indebted. Guilt arises from compensation, not abstract notions of free will. Think creditor-debtor relationships, trade, purchase, sale. The creditor gets pleasure from inflicting pain, an aesthetic pleasure of power, feeling noble. This sadistic impulse is the basis of all artificial hierarchies. Nietzsche extends this. The state itself originated from this relationship, standing as creditor to its members. As societies grew wealthier, this sadistic pleasure was even capitalized, turned into a commodity with exchange value. Pain could be stored, taxed, socialized. He even jokes about a future where accumulated pain allows society to forgive criminals instead of punishing them. But how does justice emerge from this immoral existence? Nietzsche argues it's an instrument used by the strong to manage the rancor of the weak. How? By taking the object of revenge away, redirecting anger towards common enemies of peace and order, forcing compromises, or setting up laws as scales of equivalence. Law transforms a personal slight into an objective relationship, changing how everyone perceives the situation, even the victim. From a biological perspective, legal conditions are exceptional because they limit the radical life will to power, serving the collective goal of creating greater power constellations. But its long-term effect, demoralization, nihilism, legality becomes a weapon against struggle itself. This leads Nietzsche to lay out the ontological basis for his historical method. Pay attention to this quote. The actual causes of something's origin are different from its eventual uses. Everything gets reinterpreted by those in power for fresh intentions. This is a massive rejection of standard historical explanations, mechanistic cause-effect chains, organic growth, contextual narratives. For Nietzsche, history isn't a process but a series of moments linked by the intentions of those acting at the time. He wants to destroy both teleology and causality as we usually understand them. Meaning isn't found in a linear progression, but in the constant reinterpretation and rearrangement of things by current powers. Evolution becomes a chain of appropriations and counterattacks, not a smooth path towards a goal. What does this mean for progress? Nietzsche argues that true progress requires degeneration, loss of meaning, even death. Progress always appears as the will and means to greater power, achieved by sacrificing lesser powers. It's an affirmation of tragedy. The scope of any progress is measured by what must be sacrificed. Sacrificing humanity as a mass for the welfare of a stronger species would be progress in his view. He's offering this as an alternative to the bourgeois idea of adaptation, pushing for activity over passivity in evolutionary thought, whether in society or nature. Returning to pain and conscience, Nietzsche notes that punishment reinforces fear and control, forming the bedrock of civilization. Even punishment reveals a secret bond. The judge shows the criminal that no action is intrinsically wrong, only actions under specific circumstances. Think of Julian Sorel in The Red and the Black realizing this. Bad conscience, for Nietzsche, is a learned malady, a result of systematically damming up instincts. This interiorization creates the soil for the soul. And the soul in turn fuels self-mutilation, inventing spirits to supposedly resent our animal impulses. Religion, then, arises from this spectacle of the animal soul turning against itself. Gods are invented as the eternal audience for this drama. Interestingly, Nietzsche's account of society, conscience, and religion bears a striking resemblance to Marx's in the German ideology. But there's a crucial difference. Marx rooted it all in survival, scarcity, division of labor. Nietzsche, however, points to a psychological engine, the will to power. This force, which he saw as more fundamental than the will to life, explains not just domination and exploitation, but also self-destruction. How else to explain the excesses of the powerful even in plenty, or the exploited accepting servitude? How else to account for self-repression and the strange dichotomies of good bad and good evil? Nietzsche's answers lie in his psychology of repression, driven by the will to power. He positions himself as a historical psychologist, perhaps even Freud's equal. Nietzsche anticipated Freud but diverged sharply. Freud needed a generalized primal crime, the Oedipus complex lived through by the entire species to explain conscience. Nietzsche didn't need that. He found the origin in a simple power dynamic, a warrior aristocracy imposing form on a mass. Bad conscience arose not in the aristocrats, but in the subjects, whose repressed will turned inward, leading to the idea of ugliness and thus beauty. Concepts like beautiful, good, and true arise from the consciousness that is acted upon, not acting. They define what bad, false, and ugly are not. These concepts are products of fractured wills. Society's continuity, Nietzsche argues, rests on a debtor-creditor relationship imagined between generations, living people, and ancestors. Early societies felt a strong juridical obligation to ancestors, believing they owed back sacrifices and achievements. Interestingly, success increased dependence on ancestors, while failure decreased respect. Following this logic, ancestors became so fearsome they transformed into gods. We inherit not just good-bad notions, but also hierarchy, tribal gods, and this burden of debt. Redemptive religions cut this knot via individual guilt, demanding abandonment of earthly pleasures. Christianity, for Nietzsche, represents the pinnacle of this guilt. Thus, the decline of belief in God should bring a decline in guilt, a second innocence. Escaping this generational debt means escaping historical consciousness. This brings us to ascetic ideals. Nietzsche sees the development of asceticism as stemming from the human will's fear of the void. Will needs an aim. If passions are blocked, necessity can become virtue, chastity an ideal. Ascetic ideals deifying pain and mutilation arise from this. The entire realm of higher culture, Nietzsche suggests, is a product of sublimating this impulse. In art, this reaches its peak with Kant's idea of disinterested pleasure, the willless artist. Schopenhauer took it further, seeing beauty as a release from the will. Nietzsche counters with Stendhal, beauty excites the will. The triumph of Kant and Schopenhauer aesthetics, for Nietzsche, signifies the triumph of intellect over will, the spectator ideal over the actor ideal. It's the triumph of the concept over the image, leading to ironic consciousness. But is this ascetic culture genuine? Nietzsche says no. It's a dodge, philosophers expressing an inverted will to power through virtues aimed at pure intellection. Yes, some asceticism is necessary for thought, but at what cost in animal energy? Reason and freedom were bought dearly. Why did philosophers adopt this ascetic guise? Nietzsche suggests it started as a survival tactic against priests. The philosopher, enemy of religion but lacking prestige, wore a priestly mask. Sadly, the mask stuck, turning the impulse for freedom into a new, equally ascetic religion. Philosophy eulogizes the hobbled thinker, just as art eulogizes the will-less artist. Think of Kant decreeing truth exists but reason is barred from it. Nietzsche calls this the height of sadistic pleasure. The ideal knower is pure, will-less, timeless, seeking absolute knowledge. But this ignores that all seeing is perspective. The will to truth denies the apprehension of truths of things. Objectivity as the perception of a will-less knower is the enemy of both truth and will. And who embodies this ideal of the will-less knower today? Modern historians. They position themselves as mirrors before the past, rejecting teleology, avoiding judgment, simply describing and ascertaining. They disdain to act the part of judges. Nietzsche sees a decadent counterpart in aesthetes like Renan, who ogle life, wear the artist label loosely, and praise contemplation. These are spectators with the hypocritical fairness of impotence. Nietzsche saw European culture hitting the limits of its alienation. Something was gained, the will was saved, even if only for the void. But it remained a will to nothingness, a revulsion from life. The task now is to raise this will to nothingness, to self-consciousness, to make it a deliberate program, to use this refined intellect to destroy the burdens imposed by ascetic sensibilities. This would unleash the will to positive willing. History itself becomes this act of destruction and creation, becoming the superhistorical art exemplified by his genealogy. So, what's the takeaway from Nietzsche's historical philosophy? It's a three-pronged attack, a historic psychological origin story for beauty, goodness, and truth, an analysis of how conventional historical consciousness props up belief in their substance, and a call for a new life-serving historicism. This new approach needs a new psychology, centered on the will, seeing humans as image-making animals imposing form for individual purposes, free from abstract constraints. Spirit, society, state, culture, all are seen as human products, not masters. God is dismissed, the ultimate goal? Dissolve all shared bonds, even history itself, to create the autonomous individual living each present as eternity. This is the essence of Zarathustra's eternal recurrence. Nietzsche's final word on history is to dissolve the obsession with explaining or imploding it in any particular way. Forget explanation and employment. Think in terms of representation as pure story, fabulation, myth. But even this fabulation has its grammar. It sees the historical field as manifestations of the human will, strong versus weak, mediated by consciousness. Consciousness allows naming, creating a second world of culture. The history of consciousness is a fall from metaphorical seeing to conceptualizing cause and effect, leading to irony and despair. Modern historicism is a symptom and cause of this malady. The solution? Return to metaphor, promote creative forgetting, see history as raw material for image-making, not conceptualization. Abolish historical semantics. The historian is liberated, creating melodies, not telling stories with plots or explanations. History becomes fabulation. But this fabulation has ideological consequences, nihilism. Nietzsche rejects any notion of community. Politics becomes stant politics. Thought is freed from external obligations. It's a heroic affirmation of the ironic condition. This aims to liberate imagination, resisting a return to romantic hopes for shared meaning. Nietzsche leaves the world fractured, strong dominating, weak as material for artists. This schism is affirmed. His radical move was to purge history of illusions, submitting knowledge to the pleasure principle. A supreme irony. The enemy of aesthetics ends up deifying an aesthetic conception of history, making it dangerous. This fundamentally opposes Hegel, who saw historical consciousness mediating aesthetics and morality. Nietzsche separates them, dissolving consciousness to free art, but ultimately wedding art to the will to power, turning life away from the knowledge it needs. That's the radical edge of Nietzsche's historical thought.